Our guest today is David Mulroney, former ambassador to the People's Republic of China. Welcome, Ambassador.
Thank you very much, David.
Our guest has served for over 30 years in the public service of Canada. He was the Deputy Minister responsible for the Afghanistan Task Force, overseeing coordination of all aspects of Canada's engagement in Afghanistan. He also served as Secretary to the Independent Panel on Canada's future role in Afghanistan. Our guest served as the Associate Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs and concurrently as the Prime Minister's personal representative to the G8 summit in 2006. Mr. Mulroney is a distinguished senior fellow at the University of Toronto's Munk School of Global Affairs, a distinguished fellow of the Asia-Pacific Foundation of Canada, an honorary fellow of the University of St. Michael's College, and today, the former ambassador serves as the 7th president and vice chancellor of the University of St. Michael's College here in Toronto. Wow, that's a pretty impressive background.
Well, thank you, and it's great to be here.
So tell us, as an ambassador and as someone who has served in the public service of Canada for well over 30 years, what sort of training, preparation would you have in the field of negotiations to be such a senior member of the public service as an ambassador to China?
Well, first of all, let me say how impressed I am that you're undertaking this project, because this is exactly the kind of training that I wish I'd had early on in my career. I think the public service is probably doing a better job of providing training for people, but in my era, it was very much, learn as you go along. Now, I was very lucky in that I had people like Derek Burney, who later went on to run major corporations, but he was the chief of staff to Prime Minister Brian Mulroney.
Is that your brother?
He is a cousin lost in the mists of Irish history, but he's, in fact, I didn't meet him in the flesh until I was serving in China many, many years later. But anyway, Bernie worked for him, great public servant. Don Campbell, who was my mentor in the public service, an ambassador to Japan, a deputy minister of international trade, great and patient negotiator. So I tried to learn by watching, and that helped, but I really think that more formal preparation is hugely important.
In your book, Middle Power, Middle Kingdom, which I think is an outstanding book,
Thank you.
I think every public servant, every person who aspires to public life should read the book. But I noted in a number of different areas of the book, you had mentioned that you had some concerns about the organization of the public service. And I'm just wondering, how would that have impacted you in your role as a negotiator and as the ambassador for Canada to China?
One of the things I say in the book, and I feel this, first of all, I love the federal public service, and I would recommend it as a career path for any aspiring public servant out there in the university. But I do mention that I think it has a problem with leadership. And this isn't about blaming the political level. This is a public service problem. And I think what happens over time is people come to value consensus, no matter how tenuous, no matter how weak the consensus, over just about anything else. And they have a hard time thinking about the good of the country as opposed to the good of the Department of Foreign Affairs or the Canadian Forces or the Canadian International Development Agency. So sometimes what passes for Canadian strategy is really this negotiated, I'll give you some of this, for your organization if you give me some of that for mine, with no one thinking about Canada as a whole. And I really found it on Afghanistan, and I talk about this in the book, where you had the Canadian Forces doing its thing and Foreign Affairs doing its thing and CETA doing its thing. And it was only after the panel that you mentioned, the panel led by John Manley, your former colleague, who came back and said to the Prime Minister, you want to do this really complicated thing in the most difficult corner of Afghanistan, in the teeth of a ferocious insurgency. You want civilians and military to work together in a new way. You got to think about the governance. And you, Prime Minister, have to own the file. And you have to drive it through cabinet, a special cabinet committee, and it has to be driven at the very center of government in what's called the Privy Council Office, the Prime Minister's own department. If you want to do something that big and complicated, you have to lead on it. And part of the advice came because we had, I mentioned Derek Burney. He was a member of the panel, and he was very instrumental in the NAFTA negotiations and in Canada-US free trade. And he said that had to be driven by the Prime Minister. And John Manley remembered some of the work we did, around smart borders after 9/11, and he said that also had to be driven from the center. And they talked about these things as once-in-a-decade challenges. So once in a decade, or maybe even more frequently, you get these big challenges where the Prime Minister has to lead, and where individual people in the public service also have to lead. So public servants have to remember that consensus is great, but you also have to be willing to stand up and lead from time to time.
And when they do that, there are some risks, though, is there not?
There are risks, that other people are going to feel that their organization hasn't been taken care of, or that somehow you're leading, you're favoring one organization over another. So you have to be very careful as a leader to think about all of the different interests you represent and making sure that they feel that they've had their say, their day in court. But at the end of the day, after all the discussion, you have to be able to identify a way forward, and everybody's had their say, but now we move in the same direction. And we spent a lot of time in Afghanistan, and we had some very frank discussions with people like the Canadian Forces, who have their own tradition of leadership, and they're a remarkable organization, and very strong-willed people in the Canadian International Development Agency and within Foreign Affairs. But I think thanks to the work of John Manley and company, we had a very clear system where at the end of the day we could say, we're going to lead on this through the Privy Council office, and that was my job. And I reported to a cabinet committee that was chaired partly, at first it was David Emerson, later Stockwell Day. And once we've set that direction, we move forward and we meet the objectives that we've told Canadians we're going to achieve.
Share with us, if you would, Ambassador, what sort of mandate would an ambassador receive from the Government of Canada upon his or her appointment? I mean, that's pretty critical in terms of an ambassador, a negotiator, things that follow as a result of that. So share with us your mandate, and what was it?
It's an ancient position, and in the old days, the king would send his personal envoy, or the queen would send her personal envoy to another country, and we talk about diplomatic immunity. That person would be protected from being harassed in the other jurisdiction, because the person is the personal representative of the sovereign. So an insult to that person is an insult to the sovereign. Fast forward to modern times, I had a letter that went from former Governor General Michaële Jean to the former president of China, Hu Jintao, and said, "This is David Mulroney, my trusty servant. Michaële Jean is writing on behalf of the Queen. Please recognize him as my representative." And that's sort of formal and historic, but it also means that at least the office carries the authority of the Canadian government and the dignity and respect of the Canadian government and can act on behalf of Canada. That's the theory. The reality, though, David, was very different. So I talk about this in the book, when I first went overseas in the early 80s to Korea, we had an embassy of about 12 people from Foreign Affairs, one military attaché. The ambassador's word was law. By the time I became an ambassador, almost 30 years later, we must have had 12 different federal government departments represented. We had 3 provinces. We had a number of agencies like the RCMP. And all of them were responding to little tugs on the string pulled from Ottawa, 10,000 miles away, and really operating on the basis that they represented Natural Resources Canada or Fisheries and Oceans, but not the government of Canada. And there wasn't a lot of thinking back in Ottawa about how do we come together every now and then and think about big Canadian objectives. And I realized that nobody back in Ottawa was thinking along those lines. So I thought, well, I'm going to have to think along those lines. And I got my letter on the wall from Michaële Jean, and I can point to that from time to time. By this stage, I was a deputy minister, so I knew some of the deputies back in Ottawa. And what I did was I said, look, I'm going to try to create a vision that you can all share in that sets some big, major objectives for us all. Doesn't mean you can't work for your department, but you've got to see how what you're doing for your department fits in with these larger Canadian objectives.
But wouldn't Privy Council Office of the Government of Canada outline in writing to you as an ambassador, these are the things that we would want you to work on? I mean, if you looked at the current new government that has come in place, I mean, the transparency, they put on the internet, the mandate letters for ministers.
Yeah.
So would you have received something of that nature from either the Minister of External Affairs or from Privy Council office?
I did, about a year into my mandate, get a letter from Ottawa that was my mandate letter. But here's the difference between, and you'd know this very well, the difference between leadership and management. So it wasn't a leaderly letter. It was the Department of Foreign Affairs going around town and saying, give us your list of things you want David to do, and then we're going to glom that together into a single letter. So I read it, and I could remind myself about people's priorities, but it didn't, what I kept saying to Ottawa was, we have to identify not the 100 things we have to do in China, but the 4 or 5 things. And so the technique I used, knowing that there was no committee back in Ottawa that was going to bring this together. Early on, and just to remember some recent Canadian history, the Harper government, which was in power, and to remind those who are watching, ambassadors are public servants, so you can be an ambassador under Prime Minister Harper, you can be an ambassador under Prime Minister Chrétien or Prime Minister Martin. You serve the government of the day. Democratic values are central to the Canadian public service, but we're non-partisan. But Mr. Harper happened to be in power, and things have been pretty cool with the Chinese from 2006 when he took over. And he had some very legitimate concerns about human rights and other things. But I think the government probably took too long to get that sorted out. So I was lucky enough early in my mandate in 2009 that by this time the Prime Minister said, I am going to come to China. We're going to, we're going to move the relationship to a newer level. So what I did was in my first meeting with the Chinese to plan the visit, I said, why don't we think about a joint statement that Prime Minister Harper could sign with his Chinese counterpart, the Chinese Premier Wen Jiabao. I hadn't actually gone back to Ottawa to ask for permission to do this because I thought it's going to take 6 months. And so what I did was I raised it over lunch, and then in my message back to Ottawa, I said the topic came up over lunch, so I wasn't telling a lie. The topic came up, and happily, and I knew this would happen, the Chinese thought it was a really good idea. What I wanted and what we got was a joint list signed by the 2 premiers, the Prime Minister and the Chinese Premier, that would outline shared objectives. So not just Canadian objectives, but this is really important, objectives that the Chinese could also sign on to. And it wasn't a really long list, it was a short list.
So you had real clarity.
We had real clarity, and within a week of that being signed, the Canadians look at lists like this and it doesn't mean a lot to them. I'd meet with Chinese people and say, we're going to do this with you because our Premier signed on to it. So I began what I pitched to Ottawa was, let's go back to what was commonplace in the Chrétien era, where we have an annual meeting of the leaders. And in that meeting, we'll update this list, a shared vision at the level of the Prime Minister and Cabinet of where the relationship goes. And then we in the public service at the embassy back in Ottawa, with our Chinese counterparts, will work to meet that list. And that to me gave me the short list that I needed as a leader. And I could say to the embassy, to my colleagues in the embassy, to my colleague from the RCMP, for example, who might want to do 14 or 15 other things, I could say, you can do all of those things, Inspector, but remember that we've promised to do the agreement on the sharing the proceeds of crime with the Chinese. So before you do anything else, you got to get that done. So it's one way or another, you have to figure out how you get to that short list, how you hold yourself and others accountable to achieving what's on that list.
In your book, you referenced a phrase, and I'm going to quote you, megaphone diplomacy. Could you share with us what you meant by that?
Megaphone diplomacy is diplomacy by public statement. You did something and I'm mad at you. And so the Canadian government can say we're mad at Iran or we're mad at China or we're mad at various countries at various times. And it feels good for about 5 minutes to say that because it gets it off your chest. But it doesn't really change anything. And if it's a big, powerful country like China, it kind of just bounces off and they just stop listening to you for a while. It doesn't really help you to get to fixing what it is that you wanted to change.
You feel good for about 30 seconds after it's done.
You feel good for about 30 seconds, but you also have to, in a very big interconnected world, the essence of diplomacy is you have to remember that you still have to work with people. This is where diplomats get a bad reputation because they say, well, you guys just want to, make everything nice, and you never want to be tough. Not at all. It's tougher to be it's more difficult to be tough in a constructive way, to have the discussion so you make your tough points, but they get heard and you have a possibility that they get acted on. If you just yell at somebody, you've made your points, but they defensively begin to tune you out, and there's little chance that they will get acted on. I remember one instance. It was controversial, and it was around our relations with Turkey, and the fact that Turkey had not satisfactorily addressed the Armenian genocide that happened around the First World War. We had a number of ways of communicating the real heartache that Canadians of Armenian ancestry and others felt about this. But in 2006, the government used very, very blunt language, with the Turks. And it led to, the Turks were insulted and they wanted to stop talking to us. Within about 6 months, we had the war in Lebanon, and we had to evacuate thousands of Canadians from the Middle East. The ports we needed to use were in Turkey. So I had to go back to the Turkish government to say, we'd be grateful if you'd open these ports to these Canadian refugees that we're trying to bring back. And the Turks said, well, we've had a difficult relationship. And I said, I know, and we said those things. And they said, well, but we're old friends, so we're going to set that aside and we're going to work with you. That's not to say that you can't be frank and honest about difficult issues, including things like the Armenian genocide.
See,
but you have to find the language.
Just to stop you there, I'm not sure the public gets that.
Yeah. And it's I was conscious, you sometimes put political leaders in a difficult place because they have to explain this to a Canadian public that is justifiably impatient with that. The Chinese can manage that because they don't have the same kind of public to answer to. So sometimes as public servants, part of your loyalty to the government of the day is also to say, we're not going to put you in a politically untenable situation. The reality, though, is there are various ways of delivering that message. And you can deliver the message, I think, in ways that are faithful to Canadian expectations, but still allow you the opportunity to continue communicating with the country.
So let's talk about that communication style of an ambassador, negotiator. What are the ways in which you communicate difficult messages?
So one of the ways, and so people often talk about human rights in China, it's tremendously important for Canadian leaders to mention human rights in general. So we'd like to see, lawyers in China being able to operate freely. We'd like journalists. But often it's specific cases. We're interested in the fate of this person or that person. Or it might be general policies, that maybe China has decided to do something in Tibet that we don't like or we think is wrong and really in terms of human rights. You need to communicate that. If you go into a formal bilateral meeting, there are many ways to do it. So you can do it in a formal setting, and it's very much, we're sitting like this, and as you know, all the Chinese officials are here and the Canadian officials are there, and you can deliver the tough point, and that's one way of doing it. But what you'll get back from the Chinese, who are very prepared for this, is their official talking point, because your counterpart can't afford to look weak in front of his or her followers. Another way of doing that, and on the most sensitive cases, I remember one, for example, where there was an imprisoned Canadian, and we wanted to get that better treatment for that person. The Chinese, he was a dual national, so the Chinese said he's not Canadian, he's Chinese. We'd had this kind of unproductive back and forth. And I said to our minister, you can raise your point, and Ottawa's giving you that point to raise. What I would recommend is that you talk about it when you and your counterpart are walking into the dinner. So you don't have a lot of officials around, and you can make your point and say, this is important to us, this is one of my citizens, this is someone, and can you help me better understand this? And they had probably the best exchange that we'd ever had on this. Another time, we had the Canadian health minister visiting her counterpart, the Chinese Minister of Health. And we had a person, not a Canadian, but a person who had been roughed up in police custody and needed medical attention, and he was related to a Canadian. And she said, what kind of human rights issues should I mention? I said, why don't you mention this one, because he's a doctor? And make that the case that we mentioned this time, and one doctor speaking to another, or one health minister speaking to a doctor. And again, she did it one-on-one, and it it was listened to. We had scope to follow up. He said, I will do some things, have your officials follow up. So we made some progress. So sometimes you do it publicly, but some of the best work you do is privately, so that you're not so embarrassing or insulting your host that they can do nothing but just push back at you.
But before you would execute on that, whether it's the public meeting or whether it's the one-on-one, where does relationships for an ambassador come to the forefront? How much time do you have to spend on developing those relationships? Because I know domestically, we have a tendency in Canada, we spend time on developing relationships if the file is really important. So what is it like for an ambassador in terms of developing the relationships with the other side and the various stakeholders?
So the first thing is you always have to remember who you work for, that you are the Canadian ambassador and your job is at the end of the day to do what's best for Canada. And even if it's unpleasant or it costs you relationships, you work for Canada. And so you have to be prepared no matter who you're talking to, even if you've cultivated a relationship for a year and a half or 2 years, if you have to deliver a tough, unpleasant message, you deliver it in ways that do the maximum to preserve some kind of relationship, but you have to be prepared to sort of burn those relationships. And that's hard for ambassadors to do because your inclination is to be out there meeting people, winning friends for Canada. So everything you do, every transaction, every meeting, you're thinking about who is this person in relation to my objectives as Canadian ambassador? How can she or he help Canada? Some it's immediately obvious, others you file away because you're looking to make smart connections. But you're always thinking, okay, how is this important for what I'm doing? What happens when the health minister visits or when the fisheries minister visits? Do I know the kind of people that he or she need to know here in Beijing? Or I've traveled to a place in China where they buy a lot of Canadian fish or computer parts or whatever. So do I know the right people? And I would say to my young foreign service officers, we didn't send you out to China to sit in your office and read your computer screen all day. The beauty of this job is you actually have real access. If you say Canadian Embassy, people will see you. So go and find out. If you read about some interesting person, go and see them. Get out there. We had some problems with our travel budgets, but to the extent possible, get out and meet people and challenge our assumptions. Ottawa will say, well, we can't do this because so-and-so disagrees. Does she still disagree? Why don't you go ask her? So that experience of actually knowing people, asking the questions is solid gold for an ambassador and for an embassy.
You also mentioned in the book that short-term political gain is winning over the seasoned long-term view of the relationship between the two countries. Could you care to elaborate?
Well, this gets a little bit to something that you raised earlier, David, and it's how do you navigate between the instincts and views of the Canadian public and what you see as Canada's longer-term interests. So at the end of the day, democratic values win. And if Canadians ultimately decide that they don't want to do something, we don't do it. But I think political leaders also have to lead public opinion rather than simply follow it. You don't do foreign policy by taking polls. And the examples I use, I talk a little bit about Brian Mulroney in South Africa, that there was a consensus building in Canada, but in Canada, foreign policy change comes from the grassroots, but it also comes from above, and his leadership was crucial. I talk a lot about Pierre Trudeau and China. There was a significant constituency in Canada in 1968-69 who would have said, this is a bad move. The Americans were not enthusiastic. But Pierre Trudeau thought that Canadian foreign policy could not be complete without a meaningful relationship with this huge and increasingly important country. And so he led the way. The Chinese remember him forever because it was under Pierre Trudeau that they created the formula that allowed not just Canada but many other countries to recognize China. So that was leadership. If he'd taken a poll and asked Canadians, he might have waited a lot longer. So you can't ignore Canadian wishes, but you have to be prepared to lead. This gets us to places like Iran. Talking to Iran will always get you criticized. There'll always be someone to say the Iranians are capable of bad things and do bad things, and that's probably very true. But you need some part of government that is aware of what Iran is thinking, what its views are. It's too important for a globally engaged country to ignore. And at the end of the day, communicating is not agreeing.
That's a great distinction. I think a lot of people assume that when you're sharing different information, you're agreeing.
Yeah.
But you're not agreeing.
You're not agreeing. Now, how you do that is important. Remember, there was a Canadian official at the UN who, in the very clubby nature of the UN, welcomed a North Korean who'd been elected head of an important committee and was very effusive in that welcome. And that's not appropriate, and Canadians don't like it, and it's politically sensitive. I used to be very conscious, for example, when I went to Tibet, and the start of my meeting with Tibetan officials would be on TV. Your natural inclination as a human being, let alone as a diplomat, is to be friendly, and it's a very Canadian thing. I was very careful in the opening stages of the interview because that's the clip in the nightly news. It's you grinning, shaking hands, and then they say, Canadian ambassador agrees with China's policy in Tibet. That's what runs under the thing. So you have to keep a bit of a poker face and, be respectful, but be very conscious of the signals, the nonverbal signals, as well as the verbal signals that you're sending.